Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Karen Donfried with the German Marshall Fund of the United States, and it's wonderful to welcome you all here. I have the distinct privilege of also welcoming General Philip Breedlove, who is the commander of U.S. European Command and NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe. We are so delighted that you're here for one of our transatlantic talks. Today we want to focus on NATO's next steps, Warsaw and beyond. And as the three of us were just chatting, so many people talk about the road to Warsaw, and we thought that's one of the things we want to talk about. And General Breedlove said, actually, I like to think of it as the road through Warsaw. So that may be one of the themes we pick up. It's a particular personal pleasure for me to have General Breedlove here, because when I was over at the National Security Council, I had the distinct privilege of working together with General Breedlove, and I can say that he has always been a very strong, steady, and honest voice on all of these issues that are so high on our shared transatlantic agenda. So it's a real pleasure to have you here. He's also a friend of GMF's, and he's spoken many times at GMF, including at our annual signature conference, Brussels Forum, and it was terrific to have you at the 10th Brussels Forum earlier this year. We couldn't be luckier than to have Helene Cooper here as our moderator. She is the Pentagon correspondent for the New York Times. I'm sure she's known to many of you in the room because she's had a distinguished career in journalism. And she also was one of the folks who shared a 2015 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting on the Ebola crisis in West Africa. As I mentioned, today's conversation is part of the Transatlantic Talk series that GMF does, and we pair high-level government officials with journalists from the other side of the Atlantic. And often it's an American-European duo, but since General Breedlove is based in Europe, we thought we could get away with two Americans. So I hope you'll let us get away with that today. The event is on the record. You can see there are lots of cameras in the back of the room, and we are also live streaming this event. So we have an audience on the other side of the Atlantic as well. And for those of you in the room or watching on the screen, we encourage people to tweet. And the hashtag is #GMFTtalk. Again, hashtag #GMFTtalk for those of you on social media. So with all that said, I want to turn the floor over to Helene, and thanks so much to both of you again.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, Karen. I'm very excited to be here on stage with General Breedlove, and I'm going to dive right in. I need to do a blanket sort of apology first. I just got out of dental surgery this morning, so if you guys see me drooling on this side of my face, that's why. But you had mentioned when we were talking earlier that you'd like to sort of begin, and I'd like for you to do that, just with a broad brush through about the coming Warsaw NATO summit next summer. The last one was in Cardiff, I understand, last year, and I remember covering that, and covering both President Obama and then Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel. And the big news out of that summit was all about the coalition against ISIS. That's not going to be the case, I imagined, next year. And why don't you start off with your thoughts about what the key outcomes of next year's summit should be, and then I'd love to hear you tell me what you in reality think they will be.
Well, good. Thank you, first of all, and thank you all for having me here. It's good to speak to this crowd, and as I looked at the diversity of those in attendance, I expect a pretty lively question and answer period, so that's all very good. So I think that in talking about Warsaw, you start at Wales. And I was privileged to be at Wales. And I think at Wales we saw an agreement by our 28 nations to make probably the most substantive changes to our alliance in the history of the alliance. And I was privileged to sit in the room with the heads of 28 nations, including our president, and watch them with their deliberations. And I think the things that struck me most and right up front was how quick and how firm their commitment to solidarity, their commitment to collective defense, their commitment to the bedrock of what NATO is all about, how quickly that came and how stridently they carried that message, reassuring to the military commander that our leaders saw so clearly that commitment to our solidarity and to collective defense. And then we talked about all of those changes to NATO that you have seen begin since Wales, and some of them already come to fruition since Wales. Changes in the readiness and responsiveness of elements of our VJTF, changes to some of our command and control structure to better address some of the issues that we saw in a revanchist Russia, etc., and how those now, in large, are already in place. You've seen the stand-up of our NFIUs, NATO Force Integration Units, in our smaller nations forward. You've seen the multinational Corps Northeast given the mission of being ready every day, all day, for an Article 5 contingency. And then you've already seen us implement an interim VJTF. We tested it in its alert, and we tested it in its deployment, and it's already begun to exercise. Now, clearly, it is just step one of several steps to get to the final adaptation of our force structure. But I think what is good to see is that the tasks that the leaders of our nations gave us in the military at Wales, we have made great progress on already. And that's why I also mentioned that I don't like to talk about the road to Warsaw. It makes it seems like Warsaw is an end. Warsaw is anything but an end. It is the next set of agreed to adaptations that we have to make to continue to prepare ourselves and better position ourselves for the challenges that we see out there. And I think that if I could sum it up into just a couple of words, the road through Warsaw is about looking at the readiness and the responsiveness of the entire NATO force structure. Lots of talk about the VJTF. It is a very robust brigade-size capability, completely enabled by fires and ISR and other things, but it's a brigade-size unit. A brigade-size unit is not a big deterrent value. It is a great capability to meet challenges we see. Deterrence value comes in the entire NATO force structure being more ready and responsive. So I think that the road through Warsaw is about the continued adaptation of the NATO force structure, how we continue to bring our forces to better responsiveness and readiness to meet those challenges. And so that's what I see coming down the road in Warsaw.
You just did that without ever once mentioning the word Russia.
Well, I think that's important. I think that's important. So let's talk about that. Since Wales in NATO, we have talked about what we call strategic direction east and strategic direction south. And they are two very different issues. Strategic direction east is all about Russia. Mm-hmm. It's all about revanchist Russia. It's about Russia changing the rules again in Europe. Force is now a tool to change international boundaries. They continue to occupy the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. They continue to be a part of the occupation force of Donbass. And so strategic direction east is about addressing revanchist Russia. Strategic direction south is more about dealing with the problems that our southern allies see every day in the flows of people, criminality, terrorism, foreign fighters that are escaping these ungoverned spaces, starting in western Iraq, going through the Levant into northern Africa. So a very different problem. Now I'm sure we're going to get to it in Q&A, so I won't go there now, but the two are beginning to merge a little bit as we see Russia now a part of the Syria equation. But let me also point out, and I think it's very interesting, that in our last ministerials with the defense ministerials, one of our bright really well-thought ministers brought up that General Breedlove, you talk about strategic direction east, and you talk about strategic direction south. We in the north are worried about strategic direction north and what we're beginning to see happen in the Arctic with the militarization of the Arctic by the Russians. And so now there's a voice that begins to talk about strategic direction north, strategic direction east, and strategic direction south. So it is bigger than just Russia.
Today is a huge day because, as we all know, at 5:05 this evening will be the long-awaited bilateral between President Obama and Vladimir Putin. The last time the two of them sat down for a formal face-to-face was in, I think, 2013 in Northern Ireland. And a lot has happened since then. As we are all aware, Obama canceled a meeting with Putin because of Edward Snowden. We've had the Russian invasion of Crimea. We've had arming separatists in Ukraine. Back when this meeting took place, there was such a thing as a G8. There is no longer anymore. If it weren't for John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov, I don't think we'd be having too many conversations with the Russians. So I guess I'd like to ask you just how much importance do you place on this meeting today, and what realistically can we expect to come out of it?
I think I can answer the first half of that question. I'm not sure I can answer the second half of that question. So what importance do we place on this? I think it's incredibly important. We have said, and many nations have said, that we need to have a dialogue. We need to be able to communicate with and engage Russia. We talk an awful lot about Europe whole, free, and at peace. I probably am out of step, but I add prosperous to that. And if you want a Europe whole, free, at peace, and prosperous, you're going to need to engage a nation that has vast energy reserves, a nation that has vast energy infrastructure, a nation that has incredible rail and road capability to connect. And so if we are truly going to find that final way forward to be whole, free, and at peace and prosperous in Europe, I think we have to find a way to engage Russia. I think that before we can truly get to that level of engagement that gives us the opportunity we want, we also have to find a way that Russia can rejoin a community of norms that does not embrace changing international boundaries by force. And so there's work to be done. But all of that work starts with dialogue, and so I think it is very important that our senior leaders talk.
When you mentioned Russia rejoining a community of norms, can Syria possibly be that route?
Well, that's a good question. How to answer it? Any way that we can begin to have a conversation is a step towards where we need to be. I think that as the European Command Commander, and certainly as a NATO officer, I'm more focused on the European piece of this. And I think that before, if truly Russia wants to rejoin that world of norms and reason in Syria, a great first step would be to begin in Ukraine. Show that they are ready to rejoin the world of norms and Western value in Ukraine. And so that'd be what I would put on the table first there.
Do you think we understand at all? You're viewed very much within the administration as sort of a soothsayer on Russia, in part because of your position right now. Do you think that we understand what exactly Russia is trying to do with Syria?
In Syria. Well, I think that there are, again, let me answer as Phil Breedlove, not speaking. I learned very early as the SACUR that I cannot speak for 28 nations. I can speak for myself as the military commander in NATO. first of all, I think that Russia very much wants to be seen as an equal on the world stage, as a great power on the world stage. I think that Russia very much wants to take the world's eyes off of what they are continuing to do in Ukraine. Watch here, the good thing we're doing in Syria. Don't pay attention to what's going on over here in Ukraine. So I think that's very, very important. I think that Russia very much wants to maintain warm water ports and airfield capabilities in the Eastern Med, and they saw that possibly being challenged by the progress on the ground of those opposing the Assad regime. I think that Russia very much wants to enable and prolong the Assad regime because that is their legitimate door to their ports and their airfields in Syria. I think that Russia wants to be able to slow the advance of the opposition to Mr. Assad in Syria. And then, after all of that, I think that they will do some counter-ISIL work in order to legitimize their approach to Syria.
That's you listed many things before you got to ISIL.
That is the way I see it.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter said last week when he was speaking to the press standing next to the Ukrainian defense minister that he doubted whether or not, I can't remember exactly how he put it, but he said there's doubt that Russian and American interests truly converge in Syria. He said it was possible that the Russian military buildup there could amount to just pouring, and the quote was, gasoline on a fire. Are you similarly concerned? Are you similarly pessimistic?
Well, I think that if nations could come to an agreed tact to how we would deal with ISIL, this would be a good thing. I think that's that, as you heard explained there, that is the question. Is this really about ISIL, or is it about all those other things that I just listed? And so I think that what we need to do is watch what they do. I have said more than once, I'm always asked, what is Russia doing now in eastern Ukraine? Or, excuse me, let me rephrase. I've been asked more than once, what is Mr. Putin doing now in eastern Ukraine? And what I almost always answer is, if someone walks up to you and says they know what Mr. Putin is thinking, you should immediately discount what they say. I have learned that very few people know what Mr. Putin is thinking. So what we do in a military sense is we look at the capabilities and the capacities that Mr. Putin is creating in eastern Ukraine, and then derive from that what they could do, rather than try to guess what is on their mind. So here's what concerns me about what's going on in Syria. We see some very sophisticated air defenses going into these airfields. We see some very sophisticated air-to-air aircraft going into these airfields. I have not seen ISIL flying any airplanes that require SA-15s or SA-22s. I have not seen ISIL flying any airplanes that require sophisticated air-to-air capabilities. So what I am doing is what I've always done. I look at the capabilities and the capacities that are being created, and I determine from that what might be their intent. These very sophisticated air defense capabilities are not about ISIL. They're about something else.
Can you complete that thought then? What these sophisticated air defense systems are about? As
I said before, I think that high on Mr. Putin and Russia's list in Syria is preserving the regime against those that are putting pressure on the regime, and against those that they seem who might be supporting those putting pressure on the regime.
You just said that people are always asking you, what is Vladimir Putin thinking? And I was just about to ask you that. So I will rephrase that question. Do we even understand what Mr. Putin wants in Ukraine?
So I go back to the original premise. I'm not sure that I can guess what Mr. Putin wants in Ukraine. I've read the pundits just like you do, and I agree with most of them. And I look at what, again, the capabilities and the capacities that Mr. Putin is creating in the Donbass, and I ask, to what end would they be? So what we see now, some like to call it a movement towards a sort of a frozen conflict. I don't like that term. I think it's more of a warm conflict. I think that Mr. Putin is continuing to provide those things that allow the conflict to simmer in the southeastern part of Ukraine. And why would he do that? I think that what he has demonstrated is that he can destabilize and keep the situation unstable in the southeast. And why would he do that? If the situation is unstable in the southeast, this discourages foreign investment. This keeps the Ukrainian forces in the field, which is a cost and a burden to the government of Kyiv. And if he keeps the situation in southeast Ukraine unstable, it continues to demonstrate to the people of the rest of greater Ukraine, possibly, that their government can't influence or retain control of this area. So all of this is destabilizing and not helpful to a government in Kyiv that needs to get on with reform, that needs to get on with economic recovery, that needs to encourage international investment, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And a warm conflict in the southeast part of Ukraine is detrimental to all of those possibilities.
Do you think NATO is eventually going to get okay with the idea of just sustaining a warm conflict?
Again, I'm at great risk to speak for NATO, so I won't do that. I think that what is important is that the nations of the West, more than NATO, EU and others, continue to see what is happening in eastern Ukraine. We talk about getting to Minsk, to the Minsk agreement being the defining point at which we measure what's going on in Ukraine. And the implementing agreements of February last year, 12 February, point to the Minsk agreement of the year before. And in that Minsk agreement, there are some pretty important points. One of them, which I like to talk about often, is the reestablishment of the international border of Ukraine, the reestablishment of the sovereign actions of Ukraine inside of its internationally recognized borders. There are a lot of things that need to be done before we are there. Remember that we have had well over 1,500 armored vehicles and armored capabilities moved into eastern Ukraine. We have air defenses there now. We have Russian command and control structures there now. We have immense stockpiles of equipment and kit to support those forces in the east. In order to get all of that out to reestablish the border, the sovereign border of Ukraine, that will take months and months. What about a good show of faith and begin the retrograde and show that we have a responsible way forward to reestablishing the international border of Ukraine?
What do you think are the chances then of the Minsk agreement coming into fruition in the next coming months?
Next couple of months?
Not couple of months, in the coming months. I mean, the Kremlin has already continued to provide military support to the separatists in eastern Ukraine. I mean, do you?
I think this is a long-term proposition, not a short-term proposition.
So Defense Secretary Ash Carter has in some ways sort of become the Secretary of Reassurance. Everywhere he goes, it seems as if he's reassuring allies that America's military will be behind them, from Saudi Arabia and Israel to the Far East, to Japan and our Pacific allies, and definitely in the case of our Eastern European allies. Almost all of these sort of reassurance steps that we've taken so far militarily seem to be temporary. We've seen rotational deployment. We've seen more exercises. We've had supplemental funding. What needs to be permanent? What is the new normal?
So I like the second part of your question better than the first. I won't use the permanent word. What the new normal is that I think we will see these assurance measures for quite some time. And it's more than the United States. It's about our NATO allies being a part of assurance. Again, coming out of Wales, we set ourselves, I was tasked as the military leader to develop assurance measures, and they were broadly described as air, land, and sea, north, center, and south. And so we've set about building those assurance measures, air, land, and sea. You can't do sea in the middle, but you know, physics is physics. But air, land, and sea, north, center, and south. And so we have done that. We have a great rotational presence of several nations, but certainly the United States, of ground forces, which are, we say, heel to toe and continuous in the Baltic nations, in Poland, in Romania, so that we have a land presence there to train, and then that land presence also facilitates exercises or receives increased presence to do more exercises. In the air presence, we have tripled our air policing stance, so that we, before the Russian invasion of Crimea, we had one set of air policing operating in the Northeast, and now we have three. We added Amari in the north, and we've done one in the south, either in Poland or in Romania, continuously since that time. And then our sea presence has taken several forms. Increased positioning of our mine countermeasures groups. As you know now, the U.S. has 4 forward destroyers, Aegis capable, that we have continually presence now in the Med and other locations. So we have developed these air, land, and sea assurance measures, north, center, and south. I think that's the new normal. And I think that we saw that affirmed through the last series of ministerials, and that will be, I think, further defined as we go through Warsaw.
What about permanent U.S. forces in NATO East? What's your view on that?
I think that we will never see define permanent. You're talking about U.S. bases with
yes.
commissaries and hospitals and DOD schools, et cetera, et cetera.
Or you can ratchet it back, maybe not the schools.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to speak for our nation's decision makers. I'm not hopeful that we would see a large new movement of forces out of America into Europe for a lot of reasons. One, you don't uproot all the jobs of a large force in America in today's world. I think what you're going to see in the future is increased rotational presence, and I think you're going to see an increase in our forward stationing of stocks and supplies and capabilities, and then forces can go back and exercise and work to create a presence. But I just don't, in all honesty, I do not see large U.S. forces permanently, meaning hospitals, schools, commissaries, BXs, returning to Europe.
What are the next steps in Ukrainian military training and assistance then? Are we training these guys to do lethal things? I know we're not providing lethal aid at this point, but if we are, why won't we give them, if we are training them to do lethal things, why won't we give them lethal weapons?
So it's a good series of questions. I'll have to digest it about one bite at a time. What we will do in the future with the Ukrainians is largely up to the Ukrainians, what they ask for. Currently we're there training their National Guard troops. I've been there. I visited the training at Yavriv, which is a training range literally within sight of the Polish border, the extreme western part of Ukraine. And we are training them in small unit skills, just like we train ourselves in small unit skills. Anytime a small unit has weapons in their hands, how does one define that? That weapon is lethal. It could also be defensive. I mean, it's just really, this is how do you apply the words. So we are in the midst of a training program for their National Guard troops at Yavoriv. I believe there is ongoing discussions now to move to Minister of Defense troops after that. I would not want to prejudge any decisions that either our or Ukrainian decision makers make at this point.
Can you walk through for me, though, the rationale at this point in not giving them, providing them lethal weapons?
I think that I can best do that by reciting what you have heard the pundits say, and that is that lethal weapons now may be seen as provocative in a situation where there is hope that we have reached a lull or at least a decrease in the fighting. I think that's what you hear most say.
But you sound like a man who does not believe that.
You have heard me, many in this group has heard me before. I have testified that I believe that as we approach this problem, that we should not take any options off the table, that all options should be considered. That has been my advice, and it hasn't changed.
Warsaw.
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk a little bit about before we get to problems of the East, what can NATO do about problems in the South? And I'm speaking specifically now on migration.
Mm-hmm.
What should the role of NATO be here? And is this something that will be taken up in a real way next year?
So once again, I will not put words in the mouths of 28 political deciders. What I always talk about is that NATO has things that it can offer if our political leadership chooses to do that. Let me point you to two great examples. The problem of piracy off the Horn of Africa. NATO partnered with the EU. The military competency, the military command and control structure, the military force structure of NATO, married with the EU's unique other governmental capabilities, reaching into the judiciary, policing, and other ashore functions, so that the military competency afloat married to the EU other governmental competencies ashore have essentially eliminated piracy. Now, clearly, the tactics and techniques and procedures of the ships and the merchant lines have also helped. But what you saw was a great marriage of what NATO can bring to a problem with what the EU can bring to a problem, and it virtually eliminated piracy off the Horn of Africa. So we have competencies and capabilities that we can bring to a problem. And just one more quick example, I think, is the ongoing progress, slow but measurable progress we're making in Kosovo, north of Mitrovica. The ULEX mission, working with the rule of law, judiciary, policing, coupled with KFOR being recognized by both capitals, Belgrade and Pristina, as the force keeping and maintaining what we call the safe and secure environment and guaranteeing freedom of movement. So we have a KFOR NATO capability, unique military capacities and disciplines married to the other governmental capabilities of the European Union, bringing opportunity to Kosovo. So I think there are places where NATO, in concert with other entities that can address other parts of the root problem, there is opportunity there. But again, this is entirely a decision to be taken by our NATO political leadership.
Do you see a challenge then for NATO in figuring out a way to balance allies' concerns in the East versus the South?
Well, I think it's best been said, probably 3 ministerials, including at Wales, and that is we have to be big enough to do both.
Mm-hmm.
We have to be big enough to do both. And the capabilities and capacities, I know you're tired of me saying that, but the capabilities and capacities that we build and sustain in NATO, in our military capabilities, these are applicable to both problems. The air and maritime parts of the VJTF are equally applicable in the Mediterranean as they are in the North Sea or the Black Sea. So there are things that apply to both. So as we go forward building and enhancing our readiness and responsiveness, all of that brings tools to the table that can be used either east or south. The problem in the South is that there are so many more tools that need to be in the kit bag that are beyond NATO's core military competency, that we would need to be in concert with others to truly get at the issues in the South.
Thank you very much, General. I give you your audience. We're ready for question and answer. Let's start right there.
Thank you. Marek Melkiszak, OSW, Transatlantic Academy Fellow, Warsaw, Poland. My question to you, sir, is about the issue of Russia's anti-access area denial in the Baltic Sea region. We know that there is a quite aggressive posture of Baltic Sea fleet of Russia. We have also air incidents, very many of them. We have issue of Iskander missiles deployments. We have them already in Ługa rocket brigade. We will have them in next few years in Cherniachovsk in Kaliningrad Oblast. Irrespective what NATO will do on defense issues, and these are dangerous weapons with the de facto range of 1,000 kilometers, offensive weapons. Also, we have huge pressure of Russia on Belarus on establishing a new air base of Russia within Belarus. So actually, my question to you is, what should be the proper NATO response, strategic response towards that, and what you think could be feasible in that matter? Thank you.
Okay, actually, I think I saw about 3 questions embedded in that. So I'll try to dissect those a little bit. Let me first, because it's the easiest to deal with, talk about the sea and air incidents that you mentioned. First, I think we need to recognize that all nations have a right to exercise and train. We do as well. What is important is that we do these exercises and training iterations responsibly, that we adhere to norms in how we conduct them, that we properly announce them when they start, when they finish, who is going to be a part of them, what the objective are, and as we have agreed to in the past many times, invite each other to come and be a part and view said exercises. And so when it comes to exercises, if done properly, we should not challenge these. We do them as well. Clearly, there are some issues, and you have brought some of them up. Not squawking, wrong airspace, flying through congested airspace, not announcing start and finish, large size, not invited to view. There's things that need to be worked out. But let's at least say that Russia, as well as the West, has all the rights to train if done responsibly. We have mechanisms, by the way. One of the places where we actually still have good mill-to-mill communication, we do a series of talks called INC-C. It stands for Incidents at Sea, but we have broadened it to talk to air, land, and sea incidents so that we can continue to try to deconflict what is happening out there. So as to A2AD, this is A2AD, anti-access area denial. Typically, we talk about this in terms of building anti-ship and anti-air capabilities. But as you have brought up, you broadened it some to land attack capabilities. Anti-access area denial, or A2AD as we talk about it, is a growing problem. Kaliningrad is a large platform for A2AD capability, as you have pointed out. I would also point out that in their occupation of Crimea, Russia has developed a very strong A2AD capability in the Black Sea. Essentially, their coastal defense cruise missiles range the entire Black Sea, and their air defense missiles range about 40% to 50% of the Black Sea. So A2AD is not limited to the north, to the Baltic region. It has grown already in the Black Sea, and frankly, it's one of the things we're beginning to watch that they develop in the northeast Mediterranean. As we see these very capable air defense capabilities beginning to show up in Syria, we're a little worried about another A2AD bubble being created in the eastern Mediterranean. So how do we react to that? First and foremost, we have to realize that in peacetime, we need to exercise and operate in this airspace to assure that we have and declare that we have open access to the Baltic Seas and the Black Seas. And you have seen a responsible series of exercises which have been announced and conducted both in the Baltics and in the Black Seas, and those will continue as a part of the assurance measures that we talked about before. So we need to operate in those spaces to contest that they are not forbidden spaces. They are international open areas of water and air. And then second of all, as an alliance, we need to step back and take a look at our capability in a military sense to address an A2AD challenge. This is about investment, this is about training and capabilities, et cetera, et cetera.
There were a slew of questions in the back. All the way on the end?
My name is Andy Moravchik. I'm a professor at Princeton University and a senior fellow here at the Transatlantic Academy. So you've called on the Europeans to do more militarily, maybe spend more. But the Europeans are doing a lot of other things, and it's a low-growth area. So just take the sanctions are estimated to cost them 1/4 or 0.5% of GDP. They're spending a lot of money on economic renewal and things like that. So to spend money on defense now would mean to take money away from something else. And in fact, a lot of the big countries are spending less. So if you think they should, where do you think the money should come from? Do you think they should be spending less on things like sanctions, or less on military activity elsewhere, or less on getting their own economic house in order, or what?
So I'm going to answer your question, and you won't like my answer. That is a question you should pose to our political leadership. As a military individual, it's really not my remit to talk to nations about what they should do in an economic sense. I don't mean to be flip with you, but the bottom line is that's a question better asked to military leaders. But let me talk to a couple of things. The personal pronoun you used was you. I haven't called on the nations to increase their spending. What I do as a military man is call on the nations to invest wisely the money that they have, and to help them understand through programs that the SACT, the Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, and I work on. We give them investment targets and capability targets so that we can help the nations understand what they are going to invest in, how they can best add to the alliance's capabilities. So we talk about that. And then the second thing that I do is I encourage the nations to use their military force as a part of our ongoing assurance measures and adaptation measures. And this is one of the places where we've had a good response. As we set up to build the original VJTF, we felt like we needed 3 or 4 center nations to have a sustainable rotation of the center part of the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, or VJTF. And when we went to the nations and asked, we had 7 nations respond. So while the nations do face challenges in their budgets and their investment packages, what they have done is put their forces into the mix and made them available to NATO to do these things that we called for in Wales. Adapt the NRF, build the VJTF, adapt Multinational Corps Northeast, and build NFIUs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I do encourage, I again don't want to be flip, I do encourage the nations to look at their investment profiles. I am as encouraging about inside of those investment profiles hitting the 20% target, which is that 20% of the investment should be on recapitalization and buying those capital assets which enable their militaries. But again, for them as the military, I'm more about helping them shape what they do buy and then employ what they have.
We had a question right up, the gentleman in the front, right here.
Hi, Sidney Friedberg with the Reach from Breaking Defense. General, I was talking the other day with General Hodges about his component of your command. He talked about, how very different this Russian threat is from the threat officers like you grew up with in the Cold War, and how it requires not only different equipment, but different modes of operation, really a different culture in terms of initiative, decentralization, and not having large permanent bases with the commissaries, et cetera. From your standpoint, looking across all the components, with, of course, particularly a knowledge of the air, what's different about this compared to the good old, bad old days, and how, in terms of modernization investments, organizational structure, and above all, the culture on the leadership of your forces, do NATO forces need to adapt to Russia take 2?
Okay, thanks. So you've talked to Ben Hodges. I call him the Energizer Bunny. He's one of the most, I don't know how to say it. He's one of the most energized commanders you have ever met out there. And he's really making a great difference in Europe as he engages the armies of Europe. Now we're talking in my U.S. hat, as Ben is a U.S. commander, not a NATO commander. So how to adapt? Let's turn that back a little bit to when I first became the U.S. EUCOM commander. 2 years and 3 months or so ago, we were looking at how we were going to bring ourselves out of Afghanistan, what the drawdown was going to look like in Afghanistan, and then how, as a U.S. commander and a NATO commander, we would adapt our force structure after that mission began to draw down. And long before the invasion of Crimea, we decided that we had become an alliance that was very good at counterinsurgency operations. We had really perfected this business of linking exquisite intelligence to a target on the ground and then striking that target on the ground in a very precise way at exactly the right time to get the right effects. That is an important skill set, and that skill set does contribute to other military capabilities. But what we had not done for over 14 years was that larger kinetic battle, that collective defense battle, the ability to fight at brigade, division, and even corps level that we just had not done forever. And so even before the invasion of Crimea, we began thinking about how do we adapt U.S. force capability and NATO force capability post ISAF. And of course, then we had Crimea, Donbass, other issues, and we saw that truly we do need to get back to our core capabilities and capacities in NATO, those higher end capabilities that enable us to do collective defense when we now have a threat that demonstrates that they will change international borders by force. And so I think it was prescient what we had decided to do. And so now what we have done is refined our approach across the last 18 to 20 months so that we can build exercises and training that sort of re-enable, retrain, re-grasp those skill sets that allow us to meet our collective defense capabilities. And so you've seen a series of exercise, and pretty soon Trident Jaguar 15 in the southwest Mediterranean, primarily centering on Spain, Italy, etc. We will have a fairly large exercise that helps us to hone those larger force skills.
Right in the middle. It's a uniformed officer. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Spanish Defense Attaché. Always happy to see you. About the strategic direction south you mentioned, what is the EUCOM's operational relationship with AFRICOM?
Okay, so the
Thank you.
question I think is what is good to see you, my friend, is what is EUCOM's relationship with Africa? So it's twofold. As you know, the AFRICOM commander, my good friend Rod Rodriguez, really has no forces assigned to him other than now a Marine force, which is at La Besaria de Marron, as you know. And so all of the AFRICOM force structure is truly shared with EUCOM. We are a force provider to Rod Rodriguez as he needs those. So the bases of U.S. European Command, shared with our great allies like yours, from Maroon all the way around through the Mediterranean, are those platforms by which EUCOM helps support AFRICOM's missions. Item 2, clearly your nation and other nations who are in the EUCOM area of responsibility are affected by everything happening in North Africa. All the things happening in North Africa spill across the Mediterranean into your nations. And so EUCOM, supporting nations like yours, our relationship is how do we help you deal with those issues. So I say all the time that my command has its own war-fighting responsibilities. We have our own issues. But one of the things that EUCOM soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines do every day is they enable CENTCOM and they enable AFRICOM. So we have lots of responsibilities in both directions.
Let's go back to the back, second row from the end.
Hello, Maciej Pisarski, I'm Poland's DCM. And first, thank you very much, sir, for your leadership in leading NATO in this effort to reassure the allies and to deter any possible disturbance in the region. I cannot overstate the importance of NATO's presence, of US presence in the region as a factor to prevent any possible instability in the region. I have a question, but one sentence about the road through Warsaw. As a historian, I cannot help, thinking about this in kind of more historical terms. There had been very different roads through Warsaw in the past. Better to say, different powers use those roads for different purposes, to attack Poland or to attack each other. So the fact that we are talking in the context of a road through Warsaw about increasing NATO responsiveness and readiness and capability to prevent any possible conflict. I think it speaks to a great historical achievement of NATO and how NATO was efficient in breaking up the geopolitical curse that hovered over Poland and our neighbors. My question is, though, about the future. Sir, you mentioned the long-term adaptation of NATO in as a kind of a perspective for NATO summit in Warsaw. Could you please dwell a little bit more? I mean, what would be the main ingredients of that adaptation, and what kind of ambition we should set to ourselves to make it substantial and real? Thank you.
So thanks for that question. The answer is a bit broad because, again, what will happen is that the military commanders, myself, the SACEUR, and the new, and here in a couple of days, we'll have a new SACT, Denis Mercier, French Air Force 4-star. The military commanders will put on the table a series of recommendations for our political leadership to consider. I would not want to right now sort of put that cat out in the open, but I think that you could broadly understand that they will follow along the lines of what I said before. We need to continue to develop our readiness and responsiveness. We need to continue to invest in and develop a lot of capabilities. As you know, the Alliance has nations which have a lot of great, what I would call blocking and tackling, center of mass capabilities. Ground forces, certain air forces, certain naval forces. What we lack are exquisite things like strategic lift, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, cyber defense, et cetera, et cetera. So we need to take on developing those capacities in places where we are thin right now. And then again, as we talked about, we have already succeeded at changing the readiness and responsiveness of portions of the NRF. We need to continue to adapt the NRF, but that's not the end. That's why I say through Warsaw, and you correctly point out that may not be the best choice of words, but I'm trying to communicate. But the point is, we should not stop at the NRF in addressing our readiness and responsiveness. What truly will deter nations is as we bring the entire NATO force structure, even just incrementally more ready and responsive. And to the gentleman's previous question, that takes money, doesn't it? Prioritization and allocation of money in order to do that. But I think that as we go through Warsaw into longer term adaptation, it's about capabilities that we're short in, and it's about continuing to address our readiness and responsiveness.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, right in the middle.
Thank you. Let's see, is that on? Okay. Joseph Verbowski, SAIS. I'm going to try and provoke a little bit, I guess. NATO has a lot of very good capabilities in terms of industrial scale war, which I think it was originally designed for. This spear tip force is also a pretty impressive new addition to that in terms of how quickly it can respond. But it seems when we discuss both strategic direction south as well as strategic direction east, we're seeing a lot of, shall we say, a mixture of internal and external security factors. So, Russia in eastern Ukraine, well, there's also a separatist force there too, which, they're sort of intermingled. And the ability to undermine state sovereignty, even from, shall we say, from the south as well. We look at the refugees coming in on a massive scale. What kind of capabilities could NATO develop in order to address this sort of internal-external mix that you see? perhaps either the streamlining of the communications between the internal policing forces or even the integration thereof? That would be my question.
So I don't see that as provocative at all. I think that's heart of the matter on what we need to look forward. And that's what we're talking about all the time. Some people label, you talked about two things that I've written down as hybrid and South. Some people like to talk about hybrid war. I normally call it unconventional war. Hybrid makes it sound neat and new and flashy and all that. Really, hybrid is just old tools being applied in a different way, and I call that unconventional war. And then South, let me attack that one first because it's easier. As we talked about earlier, in the South, this problem is, I think, bigger than the core competencies of NATO. There's a lot of things that NATO can do about the problem in the South, but the answer in the South is not military. It's military plus a lot of other things: diplomatic, informational, economic, et cetera, et cetera. And so in the South, NATO can continue to develop capabilities and capacities that address the root problem or the problems of foreign fighter flows, extremists, terrorism, et cetera, et cetera. But the rest of governmental approaches will have to be applied to the bigger part of the problem. Ungoverned spaces, governments that cannot meet the expectations of their people, et cetera, et cetera. Those are not core NATO militaries. We need to be able to enable and pair with other organizations like the EU or the UN or whatever. So I don't think that we should be developing specific capabilities outside of what really is NATO's remit. We should pair with other organizations that have capabilities and capacities outside of that remit in the South. I hope you understand how I answered that. To the degree of this quote-unquote hybrid warfare, or what I call unconventional warfare, this is an interesting issue. And in NATO, we are already working on this to a certain degree in many of our nations that are along our eastern periphery. And this is interesting because, again, most of the problems of unconventional warfare are not truly military to begin with. Most of the problems are addressed by capabilities inside the MOI. The little green men, as they begin to show up, will first be addressed by policing and legal functions, not necessarily military functions, until we determine what they are and that they're a military force. And so we partner with our nations to help them understand and develop capabilities and capacities, there are those words again, inside of their nations to deal with these issues. We talk about recognize, characterize, and attribute. Recognize that you have an unconventional activity going on, not something legitimate. Characterize it as not a legitimate political movement. Characterize it as not something emanating from your nation. And then third, attribute it to an aggressor nation. If that is in fact the case, you might find out that it's a legitimate internal movement. But if we recognize, characterize, and then attribute to an aggressor nation, now there are things that the nations of NATO can talk about. How do we more directly aid a country that's under such an attack? So in NATO, through several of our military capabilities, to include our special operations forces both in NATO and EUCOM, we're working with nations to look at this problem inside their own country and how do they work it. And I'll just tell you that in some of the nations we work with, it's done completely differently. In one nation, it's almost entirely a military remit, and the chief of defense is given the mission. In another nation, actual nation, it is almost entirely a Ministry of Interior remit, and it is handed over almost completely to policing and judiciary functions. So we work with the nations in their own way of dealing with the problem. We help them to build capability and capacity to address it. And we talk about a framework of recognize, characterize, attribute in order to bring this to a position where we can look at it in a more NATO or alliance way.
We have about 6 or 7 more minutes left. Let's see if we can get as many as we can. Right there.
I'll try to answer shorter.
And I'll try to ask a shorter question, so thank you. General Breedlove, my name is Alexandru Coita and I'm from Bucharest, Romania. So I hope you'd excuse me if I ask a rather parochial question. Obviously the whale summit for my country was perceived as a watershed moment, and it was highly welcomed as a proof of the renewed commitment of NATO to the southeastern flank. Still, not so much maybe in Romania, but in other countries of the, let's say, the Eastern Arc, I'll call it, if you look at the Baltics, Poland, and Bucharest, there are voices who talk about maybe an insufficiently developed deterrent of the Article 5 commitment of NATO, both in operational and in political terms. Obviously, I will not ask you to comment on the political aspects of this, but I would be very interested in hearing what you would have to say from your standpoint as to the necessary and feasible ways that operationally NATO could develop and strengthen the Article 5 deterrent capability, and also in view of the Warsaw Summit of next year. Thank you.
That is not a short answer. I will try to hit a couple of high points. This is the $64,000 question. What deters? Remember that out of Wales, we were first tasked to assure our nations. And then as we developed our assurance measures, we started to talk about what are and are there deterrence values in what we're doing. What deters? Many pundits opine, and I agree, that Mr. Putin understands the difference between a NATO nation, which has an Article 5 attached to it, and a non-NATO nation. I mean, just tick off some of the places around the world, Transnistria, Georgia, Ukraine, and other places where these are non-NATO nations where Russia has invaded and holds portions of their landmass. So we have to ask ourselves, what is deterrence? And I'm going to give you a really short answer. I keep telling the nations that we have made a great progress since Wales. I've said this a couple of times now. We have increased the readiness and responsiveness of our NRF and certainly of the VJTF. We have given the SACEUR back authorities to alert and stage forces, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we have sped up and increased our ability to respond. But it's not enough. What I think deters is that the entire, I've said this now, this will be the third time, I think. What really deters, I think, is that we increase the readiness and the responsiveness of the entire NATO force structure. We have to get to these investments, exercises, and training scenarios that raises the responsiveness and the readiness of the whole force. And that's what I think deters in the long run. Very short answer to a much more complicated question.
In the back? Right there. Thanks.
Greg Tillman, Arms Control Association. With the Iran nuclear deal going forward and with the absence of any Iranian IRBM or ICBM flight testing ever, is it time for NATO to reconsider its schedule for the European phased adaptive approach, perhaps adapting the schedule to a lower anticipated threat level?
So the short answer I think I would give you is there remains a very dense and deep capability in Iran to fire conventionally tipped weapons that can threaten multiple parts of our alliance. And so I think that that we should stay on course with our EPAA.
Yes, sir.
Caleb, pardon me, Caleb Smith, Stanford University student. Question, you were mentioning Transnistria and South Ossetia. What do you think should be done about these geopolitical anomalies, and why do you think what you think?
So I've never heard them called a geopolitical anomaly. I'm not a Stanford graduate. I'm a simple Georgia Tech graduate. I would offer that the frozen conflicts, of which there are several out there, are not conducive to any sort of forward progress in places like Ukraine and others. These seem to be tools that are used in order to preclude a nation from being able to develop a leaning to where they want to lean, whichever direction it is. We don't go out and try to force a nation to lean one way or another. A nation makes its own choices, etc., and then we see sometimes actions taken to have a quote-unquote veto on how they might progress. And so I do not think that we should accept incursions across internationally recognized borders holding the sovereign lands of another nation in order to preclude that nation's aspirations of taking whatever steps they want to take in whatever direction. We don't recognize that as an appropriate tool. And I don't think that we should into the future. Again, if a nation wants to become a part of the responsible nations who address great problems of the world like ISIL, then show responsible behavior across all spectrum of these kinds of issues.
That sounds to me like a great way to end. Karen gave me her watch to make sure I kept us on time. Thank you very much, General.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You all.